to replenish the supply of hot air. In any case, as the air in the balloon begins to cool, it loses buoyancy and settles back to Earth. In 1766, the English scientist Henry Cavendish had demonstrated the properties of the gas hydrogen, which is only about 1/15 as heavy as air. The first successful ascent in a balloon filled with this new lifting agent came only 10 days after the initial hot air balloon ascent. For 138 years, hydrogen was used as the lifting gas during aircraft. Although the use of hydrogen was less dangerous than carrying a fire aloft to produce hot air, its explosive nature made its use extremely hazardous. But early aeronauts went ahead with great courage, achieving remarkable records for distance and altitude, despite the fact that their fragile craft were completely at the mercy of the winds. The first successful dirigible or steerable balloon was flown by Henry Giffard on September 23, 1852, using a steam engine for propulsion. The development of dirigible balloons was slow during the next 45 years until 1898, when the Brazilian aeronaut Alberto Santos Dumont made the first gasoline-powered flight at Paris. Other experimenters his lead, among them the German Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, who completed the first dirigible with a rigid framework in 1900. In 1911, Zeppelin began the operation of the first commercial airline, carrying passengers between two German cities. During the war, which began in 1914, Germany put the Zeppelin to military use in bombing raids. England and the United States, although they had successfully operated small dirigibles, limited lighter-than-air construction mostly to non-rigid captive balloons anchored to the ground. But these sausage balloons, more properly called fight balloons, were employed in observation service in the front lines for spotting artillery fire and for observing enemy troop movements. Following English precedent, the United States in 1916 began making a number of blimps or small non-rigid dirigibles for military use. It was in a Navy blimp that helium gas was first successfully used as a lifting agent in 1921. Because it is non-inflammable and almost as light as hydrogen, helium was immediately adopted by the United States for use in all subsequent Army and Navy lighter-than-air craft. Our monopoly of this important gas is of great strategic importance, and it has eliminated the fire hazard to American airships. The long-distance possibilities of the Zeppelin type of rigid dirigible were brought to the attention of the American public when the British R-34 arrived over Long Island after a transatlantic voyage. While the R-34 drifted over the landing field, an officer descended by parachute to instruct the ground crew in the unfamiliar technique of hauling down the big airship. As we were to discover in later years, the handling of big dirigibles is a complicated art difficult to master. In 1923, the United States Navy launched the first large American-made dirigible, the ZR-1, at Lakehurst and christened it the Shenandoah. A crew of American Navy men with German advisors took over its operation, and the Shenandoah completed 2 years of service. Encountering a storm over Ohio, the aluminum alloy framework of the airship proved unequal to the strain of conflicting air currents, which destroyed the Shenandoah. A more successful record is that of the ZR-3, completed in 1924 at the Zeppelin plant at Friedrichshafen, Germany, for the United States. Under command of Dr. Hugo Echner, the ZR-3 took off from Germany for a transatlantic flight non-stop to the Naval Air Station at Lakehurst, New Jersey. In 80 hours and 45 minutes, the ZR-3 completed her historic crossing. Navy officials accepted the ZR-3 at Lakehurst and named her the Los Angeles. Of all the large United States dirigibles, the Los Angeles is the only one to end her active service by honorable retirement. Modern commercial use of the dirigible began with the German Graf Zeppelin, which crossed the Atlantic with 20 passengers in October 1928. Dr. Hugo Echner, veteran airship commander, was in charge of the many subsequent flights of the Graf Zeppelin, which carried hundreds of passengers across both North and South Atlantic. In the autumn of 1929, the huge dirigible undertook a flight around the world, completing the long journey in a few hours more than 21 days. The United States Navy designed and built two gigantic dirigibles which embodied a number of improvements in design. The first of these ships, the Akron, went into commission in 1931. Among the innovations found in this airship were a new type of keel construction and provisions for carrying 5 scouting planes. Early in 1933, the Akron's sister ship, the Macon, made her maiden flight. Both of these great American dirigibles were destroyed by accidents at sea, but the casualties were very low because the use of helium as a lifting gas prevented explosion and fire. On March 4th, 1936, the great German Zeppelin Hindenburg was launched. By the use of oil-fed diesel engines, her designers avoided adding the fire risk of gasoline to the known hazard of more than 7 million cubic feet of hydrogen gas. The Hindenburg certainly merited the name airliner, capable provision for the comfort of her passengers. But the gas bags of the Hindenburg, 10 successful passenger crossings of the Atlantic were completed in 1936. On May 6, 1937, as the Hindenburg reached Lakehurst after that year's first crossing, a mysterious explosion destroyed the great ship of the air. Roaring flames of hydrogen, the twisted skeleton of the giant airship in which 36 passengers met death. These tragic symbols marked the end, at least for a time, of lighter-than-air transportation. Many experts believe, however, that the airship has certain advantages which will someday assure its place in aerial transportation. Only time can tell what will be the fate of the rigid airship, which has been called man's boldest engineering experiment. The first living creature to fly existed millions of years ago, a flying reptile, the pterodactyl. In time, reptilian scales evolved into feathers, and eventually came the development of the bird, which is the inspiration for man's efforts toward true flight. The first man-made device that rose into the air was the kite, which reached a high degree of perfection in China many centuries before the beginning of our civilization. In the 15th century, the magnificent artistic and mechanical genius of Leonardo da Vinci produced the designs for several flying machines. A model built from one of da Vinci's designs is part of the unrivaled aeronautical collection in our... But the first heavier-than-air device actually to rise in free flight was entirely different in design and appearance. It was a toy helicopter made with feathers. Sir George Cayley of England was one of the first to advocate the study of heavier-than-air craft as a means for solving the mystery of true flight. The flying machine which Cayley designed was a helicopter, a boat-like device with steam-driven propellers mounted vertically to lift the machine from the ground. Following Cayley's lead, William Samuel Henson in 1840 tried to finance the building of aircraft intended to connect the various parts of the British Empire. Henson's design called for a monoplane with a wingspan of 150 feet, powered by a 30-horsepower steam engine. After Henson became discouraged, his partner John Stringfellow built a model plane which in 1848 flew a distance of 120 feet. This was the first successful demonstration of the principles of dynamic flight. In Australia, Lawrence Hargrave made an important contribution to aircraft design with the development of improved stability in the box kite. In 1889, Pithancourt of Paris devised an ornithopter, or bird-winged flying machine, which flew by flapping its wings up and down. In the United States, a patent was granted in 1889 to the maker of this weird model. Needless to say, the machine didn't work. The experimenters who most advanced the art of flight during this period were those who experimented with gliders of sufficient size to enable them to coast on the air. This glider, constructed by Otto Lilienthal of Germany in 1894, completed more than 2,000 successful glides. It is demonstrated here by Paul Edward Garber, in charge of the aeronautical collection of the United States National Museum. Lilienthal's gliders were controlled by shifting the weight of the operator's body. The end of the 19th century saw the successful gliding experiments of Octave Chanute, a distinguished American engineer. Chanute produced in his designs a new factor of stability and devised control surfaces for steering the glider. Chanute was also responsible for the introduction of truss construction, which provides increased strength. The first large power-driven model airplane was flown on May 6, 1896. Built by the American scientist Samuel Pierpont Langley, this was number 5 in a series of machines which he called aerodromes. Powered by steam, this model flew 3,200 feet above the Potomac River. Based upon this design, Langley built a full-sized man-carrying aerodrome under a War Department appropriation. 1903 brought the official test of the big aerodrome, and the test brought disaster. Discouraged, Langley ceased experimentation, but the same aerodrome was reconstructed and successfully flown by Glenn Curtiss in 1914. Nine days after Dr. Langley's disastrous experiment came the first controlled human flight. On December 17, 1903, at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, Wilbur and Orville Wright in turn took off for the first sustained flights in an engine-driven airplane. Continuing the successful gliding experiments of Chanute and Lilienthal, the Wright brothers had built and flown efficient gliders, and it was experience gained in glider construction that aided them in developing the first successful airplane. In the Wright airplane, the elevators were placed in front of the main structure on outriggers, while the rudder was similarly mounted on outriggers behind. Instead of ailerons, which were a later development, the Wright brothers employed wires and pulleys for twisting the tips of the wings to tilt the ship from side to side in flight. The plane was launched from a monorail by means of a rope and falling weight. And now, having reached the moment of man's first flight, let us see what it is that keeps an airplane in the air. The first sustained flight in Europe was made in September 1906 by Alberto Santos Dumont. The box kite construction of his plane lent a certain amount of lateral stability. Most Europeans doubted reports of successful American flights until a Wright brothers flight in France finally convinced them. In 1908, Glenn Curtiss advanced America's lead in aviation with a new type of construction which introduced ailerons, or little hinged wings, to control lateral motion. This development eventually replaced the wing warping arrangement of the Wright brothers. The celebrated monoplane Antoinette, developed by Levasseur of France, was one of the first single-winged airplanes, and it proved superior to other designs so far evolved, particularly as a wind fighter. With Levasseur himself swinging the propeller, the Antoinette was first flown by Latham in November 1908. Improvements in design during 1909 brought about increased maneuverability, particularly in the case of the famous Blériot monoplane, which set a high standard of performance. On July 19, 1909, Louis Blériot, designer and pilot of this remarkable little airplane, startled Europe with a flight of 31 miles. Blériot was one of the greatest personalities in the developmental period of heavier-than-air craft. Santos Dumont successfully completed several short journeys in the famous monoplane Demoiselle. By this time, actual flying competition had begun with a French air meet in August 1909. In October 1910, an American aviation meet took place at St. Louis. Theodore Roosevelt climbed to a precarious perch beside the famous pilot Arch Hoxsey. Colonel Roosevelt's enthusiastic reaction to his flight focused public attention upon the advances made in airplane design and converted many skeptics to interest in aviation. Many novel designs evolved from early European efforts. The gyroplane of Louis Breguet achieved short flights. Louis Paulin's Gypate triplane was surely radical in construction. Somewhat better performance was achieved by the Sloan bicurve and similar attempts to secure more efficient lifting surfaces. 1911 saw the appearance of one of the first passenger transport ships, the Albazard Airbus. This year was also notable for the development in America of Curtiss airplanes designed to take off from water instead of land. Coffin, a well-known pioneer flyer, demonstrated an early Burgess Wright float seaplane in a notable flight which ended in New York Harbor. It was obvious that the ability to operate from both land and water would add to the airplane's usefulness and safety. And so came the development of the early amphibian planes. In the period just before the beginning of the World War, the most efficient and popular airplanes still bore a strong resemblance to the earliest designs. Many famous pilots flew these planes as the use of aircraft became more widespread. Miss Ruth Law and her Curtiss biplane became familiar sights to thousands of enthusiasts in all parts of the United States. With the increasing use of aircraft, and particularly because of the impetus given the industry by the outbreak of the World War, factories began to turn out large numbers of planes on both sides of the Atlantic. By this time, the design of aircraft had become fairly well stabilized. More efficient power plants had been developed, and the stability and maneuverability of the average plane was much improved. The harrowing years of the World War brought specialization to airplane design. Civil flying practically ceased while the aviation industry of the warring nations turned attention to the development of many types of military planes. The war accelerated progress in man's conquest of the air, but combat planes possessed qualities far different from those required for civil use. Speed and maneuverability were all important in war aircraft. In 1914, 70 miles per hour was a very good airspeed, but by 1918, an English pursuit plane was doing 160 miles per hour. Monoplanes were almost entirely superseded by biplanes, which were at the time stronger and better fitted for strenuous aerobatics. An important development during the last year of the war was the establishment of the first airmail route from New York to Philadelphia and Washington. On May 15, 1918, Lieutenants Webb and Edgerton brought mail through to Washington in a wartime plane. The first of many spectacular transatlantic flights was undertaken in 1919 by 3 United States Navy flying boats designated as the NC Squadron. Leaving North America at Newfoundland on May 16th, they flew toward the Azores. En route, the NC-1 and NC-3 landed to take their bearings and were disabled by the seas. The NC-4 was the only one to reach the Azores by air. After refueling and awaiting better weather, Commander A.C. Reed and his 5 companions took off in the NC-4 for England. On June 14, 1919, John Alcock and A.W. Brown of England made the first non-stop flight across the Atlantic from St. John's, Newfoundland to Clifton, Ireland in about 16 hours. Despite a minor crack-up on landing, the flight won a $50,000 prize offered by the Daily Mail. A short time later, headlines announced the establishment of a passenger service between Paris and London, marking the start of commercial aviation in Europe. In the United States, after several unsuccessful attempts, the first non-stop transcontinental flight began on May 2, 1923. Lieutenants McCready and Kelly of the United States Army Air Service flew the T-2, a modified Fokker transport, from New York to San Diego in 27 hours. Another memorable Air Corps achievement was credited in 1924 to the World Flight Squadron, led by Major Frederick Martin. 4 Douglas planes left Seattle on April 6, 1924. The leading plane cracked up in Alaska, but the flight continued under the leadership of Captain Lowell Smith, and 2 of the original planes finished the historic passage. The first around-the-world flight was completed in an elapsed time of 175 days. A period of experimentation which intervened at this time brought such developments as this flapper plane. By pedaling furiously to gain momentum, the inventor expected to take off with the flapping of wings, but he didn't. A contemporary effort was the cycle plane built by an American idea man. The idea may have been good, but the cycle plane wasn't, so no records were broken. Later came bird-like planes built in a search for greater stability, but few of them were successful. For years, the helicopter was classed with perpetual motion as a physical impossibility. But with propellers mounted to lift the ship vertically, the Terras Pescara of Paris actually made a flight of 20 feet at an altitude of 24 inches. A new era of geographical discovery began with the first great exploration flight of Commander Richard E. Byrd and Floyd Bennett. Taking off from Kings Bay, Spitsbergen in a Fokker tri-motor transport plane on May 9, 1926, these two pioneers flew northward to the pole and back in 15 hours. This was the first of many important flights through which Admiral Byrd has demonstrated the value of heavier-than-air machines in exploration. With the posting of a $25,000 prize for the first non-stop flight between Paris and New York, two French aviators, Captains Nunez-Serre and Colly, set out from Paris on May 8, 1927, in an attempt to cross the North Atlantic in a non-stop flight to New York. They had planned to fly a direct course to America, but somewhere en route they met with unforeseen difficulties and vanished forever. May 20th, 1927 is the date of the most romantic adventure in the history of aviation. On this chilly gray morning on Long Island, a young air mail pilot announced his intention to fly to Paris. With his plane groaning under a tremendous load of fuel, he barely cleared power lines at the edge of the field. Charles Lindbergh was on his way to Paris alone. A crowd of thousands surged over the Paris airport at Le Bourget, cheering wildly when they sighted the small silver monoplane. In 33.5 hours, Lindbergh had completed his historic flight of 3,610 miles, and the people of France made him the man of the hour. Upon his return to America, New York gave Lindbergh a welcome that has never been equaled in the history of that enthusiastic city. Lindbergh's trail-breaking flight was followed shortly by eastward crossings by Clarence Chamberlain and Richard E. Byrd and his companions. It was not until 3 years later that a Paris to New York non-stop flight was made. In a Breguet plane on September 1st, 1930, Dieudonné, Coste, and Maurice Bellant flew to New York in 37 hours and 18 minutes. Amelia Earhart, who had already flown the Atlantic as a passenger, determined to be the first woman to make a solo hop to Europe. On May 20th, 1932, she took off on the Eastward Passage. Flying almost the same course as that taken by Lindbergh, she headed along the shortest path which lies well up in the North Atlantic. But her plans miscarried, and on May 21st, she came down at Londonderry, Ireland, after a flight of 2,026 miles in 15 hours and 18 minutes. An amazing spectacle was the mass flight of 24 military seaplanes from Italy to the United States. Under the command of Italo Balbo, this air armada flew in 7 hops from Orabatello, Italy to Chicago in July 1933. Successfully completing the westward hop, the Italian flyers were received with much acclaim in several American cities before the beginning of their return journey. The round-trip mileage of this great mass flight was about 12,000 miles. Spectacular in 1933, flights of this caliber have since become routine. For example, in July 1939, a crew of 105 officers and men delivered 15 long-range bombers assigned to Hawaiian patrol duty in an uneventful non-stop flight across the Pacific from the Naval Air Base at San Diego. Such flights as this are common and little publicized in America's present-day naval and military aviation. One of the most gallant flights in the annals of aviation took place immediately after Balbo's mass flight from Italy. On July 15, 1933, the American aviator Wiley Post started on a lonely, hazardous solo flight around the world. In 1931, Post had completed a record world flight with Harold Gatty, but this time in the same plane, the famous Lockheed monoplane Winnie Mae, he flew alone. 7 days, 18 hours, and 49.5 minutes after his takeoff, Wiley Post completed a 15,600-mile journey, which earned for him a permanent place among aviation's immortals. One of the most significant flights in aviation history is a round-the-world dash made quite recently, July 1938. Howard Hughes, equally well known as a pilot and as a movie producer, decided to make the most complete preparations possible for every stage of the journey. His plane, an especially fitted Lockheed monoplane, was equipped with every known modern instrument for aerial navigation. When the flight was completed in 3 days, 19 hours, and 8 minutes, Hughes had conclusively proved the value of adequate preparation, high-grade equipment and efficient navigation. Operating through such agencies as the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, which maintains developmental laboratories,